Come on up, guys. And you can read their bios, so I'm not going to belabor them, but we have Simon Goodall, who's a partner at Boston Consulting Group and has led their work with CHI recently on FDA performance. We have Ron Warren, who's a principal consultant with Medical Device Consultants, Marti Conger, who's a patient advocate in the center there, and Farrell and Powell, who's divisional vice president and general manager at Abbott Structural Heart. So what I might
You forgot me.
Did I thought I
Did you? No, you
did I
didn't hear
forget
my
you?
name.
Well, I forgot my board member, Paul Hastings, who's the CEO of OncoMed. So we have a really good distribution of device, biotech, if you will, biopharma, and patient representatives here. And I might start with Simon Goodall and ask Simon just to recap a little bit of the work that we have done in the past coming up into this year, because we've done a great deal of work with Boston Consulting Group on FDA performance. And perhaps reflect on, the question was in the room about what was happening in the past with respect to review times, for example, on drugs and devices, and what have we found as we moved into to today, Simon?
So, I mean, I think it's certainly a very interesting 18 months to have been taking a very close look at drug and device regulation and the relationship with the FDA. I think we may look back from this in several years' time and, we might feel positively about it, or it might be different. I don't know. Many of you will have seen the report that we published earlier this year that took a perspective, really a 20-year perspective on the FDA and really raised some red flags and warnings about what had been happening in recent years, really since 2007, 2008, in the process and time it takes to approve not only new drugs, but also new medical devices via the PMA and 510K routes. And basically across new drugs and new devices, we saw a consistent pattern of lengthening review times, an increasing trend towards multi-cycle reviews for drugs, and also some sort of troubling signals about a slowdown in the access that American patients were getting to new medicines relative to other parts of the world. Maybe we're beginning to see some change in 2011. We've been working, crunching the data, and in fact, the data that the FDA issued today on the new drugs and devices is something that David and I and other members of the team with CHI have been looking at for a while. 2011, looks to be a very good year in terms of numbers of approvals. Clearly, we're all, and many companies in this room are very excited about their products having gotten to market this year. And certainly the approval times are much lower than they have been for most of the past several years. But, if you pop the hood underneath that and look at it a little bit, as Vicky said, the thing you can't really talk about is what else is happening. What's happening to other drugs that are in process? And I think there was a question from the floor that there was a question about diabetes drugs. We try to take a look by submission years, and we try to keep a track on all of the other products that are being worked on. We still have drugs that were submitted into the system in 2007 and 2008 that have yet to get a final decision. They may be been through 1, 2, or more cycles, so they're building up and holding in the backlog. We've had, there are still some of those drugs that are entered the market in 2009, entered the process in 2009, 2010, that are still being worked on. And even more, and this one would never really be able to prove very much, is when does this actually start to change behavior? When does a company say it's not worth actually developing a drug that isn't going to meet the criteria that the FDA seems to be laying down for what is approvable, which is not maybe the sort of first-in-class breakthrough, but maybe the second or third-in-class that offers an incremental benefit or another choice to physicians? We just heard that's not quite what we're looking for. So I worry a little bit, and I sometimes use the words, are we looking towards a bimodal system where if it's something that fits the profile, we can move it through really quickly, and there's a number of pathways, and if it doesn't fit the profile, back of the queue, multiple cycles. I hope not, but one worries a little bit.
Well, and Simon, I think as we heard, particularly in the diagnostics program, where medicine is going and where innovation is going may be toward things that don't fit the stereotype, that don't fit standard ways of thinking. So it may pose a challenge for the FDA to be creative and flexible in ways that can be effective with the new world of medicine. Well, one thing we know for sure, though, is that the FDA is not monolithic. In other words, the way it reviews devices is quite different than drugs, and the way that it reviews different classes of drugs, depending on the disease category and so forth, can be quite different too. Farrelyn, could you talk a bit about what your experience has been with respect to medical devices over the past several years?
Sure, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I've been in the medical device industry for over 20 years, so throughout the period of your survey, and have seen the changes within the agency and the relationship between industry and the agency. The product specifically that I'm working on now, I've been working on for the last 12 years, so 12 of those 20 years. And the environment has changed significantly during that time frame. The product actually is a first-in-class innovative device that does require different thinking than what, it's not the next generation or a Me Too product. Actually, if I could just take a minute to explain the product. It's a catheter, so similar to angioplasty or stenting, where you put a long tube up through the leg, and our product actually goes up in through the vein, and the physician moves that up into the heart. You go into the left atrium and actually use a small clip on the end of that catheter to repair the mitral valve. The mitral valve is a valve inside of your heart that controls blood flow that's coming in from the lungs, going into the ventricle, which is the significant pumping chamber of your heart, which when it contracts, it pumps all the blood to your brain and your appendages. The mitral valve is there to close when the pump contracts, so that the blood doesn't go back into your lungs. If the valve is leaking, blood goes back into your lungs, you become short of breath, you get fatigued. Your heart compensates for that, but then over time, after chronic volume overload, after your heart's been leaking like that for a long time, you start to develop heart failure. That progresses to the point where the symptoms continue to increase, and often you become hospitalized, you're on beta blockers, ACE inhibitors. And so the idea is to fix the valve. And surgery does a great job of fixing the valve. They've been doing it for 50 years, either repairing or replacing the mitral valve. And similar to bypass surgery, we've identified now a way to perform this procedure using a catheter, similar to angioplasty or stenting, instead of open arrested heart surgery. And the goal is really to do this on patients who are not good surgical candidates. So elderly, you're over 80 years old, you've had a couple surgeries before you. But how does the FDA, how do physicians understand if the results are good enough for this product compared to the gold standard that's been around for 50 years? And that requires a lot of analysis and different ways of looking at things. And so that's part of the experience now, is in a real life case, working through what's required to get a new innovative technology like this approved in the United States. We've treated over 3,500 patients worldwide now. It's been commercially available in Europe since 2008. We were a startup company since 1999. We're acquired by Abbott Vascular, which is a California-based company. Abbott Vascular is with 8,000 California employees. And we're now working as part of this large organization to work through the process with the FDA in a collaborative fashion to get this product approved in the United States.
Without going into exhaustive detail, can you characterize in a top-line way the difference between the European approval system and what you experience at the FDA?
Well, we were approved in 2008 in Europe, and that was based on actually US data. So we did all of our clinical studies in the United States. Europe accepted that US data. We had 6-month follow-up that showed it was extremely safe. We didn't have long-term data to understand what the long-term efficacy of the product would be. And that's really the key between Europe and the US, is prove that the product is safe, and then let the physicians determine who it works best in and the efficacy of the product. In the United States, the hurdle is much greater from a regulatory perspective to prove both safety and efficacy prior to an approval of a product. So it's just very different.
I ask Simon for a very brief comment, because one of the ongoing themes in the conversation about the differences for medical devices in Europe and the US is that there might be safety differences. But you've studied this, Simon, and what have you found?
Certainly, we've studied it and looked really back at all the devices that were approved both in Europe and the United States, looking back about 7 or 8 years, and the incidence of Class 1 recalls, of the most serious recalls, it was really no different. So it doesn't appear that the American system, performs a material safety benefit. Clearly, they might be looking for a different efficacy standard. But the story you described of an approval in Europe 2, 3, 4 years in advance of the US, and a small company ultimately having to be acquired by a large company in order to get to the US market, that is the story.
Right.
So Ron, you're looking at the industry from a broader, more comprehensive perspective. What are you saying that either fits or doesn't fit in with the theme that we're talking about here?
So yeah, there's a lot of thoughts here. I think you can look at individual cases and see examples of success and examples of major failures when it comes to the regulatory process within the FDA. I guess my comment about the European comparison is you're talking about a regulatory standard that's basically meeting the essential requirements, and so it's very much based on a set of global standards that are recognized among the member states. And whereas in the FDA, if you're talking about Class 3 products, the regulatory standard is reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And that's where it gets a little bit hazy and very challenging for companies, because this idea of reasonable assurance is very subjective. And so you can look within the agency, within CDRH, and you can find examples where this idea of reasonable assurance is pretty well understood, and the review process appears to go through fairly routinely. And on average, there's something like 20 or 30 PMAs that are approved each year. And but it's the challenge, and I think the things we really hear about are when we're talking about the more advanced technologies that are trying to redefine or completely revolutionize the treatment of a particular disease or condition. And that's where it gets very difficult to understand what is reasonable. The companies are going to the FDA and asking for guidance on what kind of data do you need, and it's often very difficult to zero in on that, because it takes a long time for regulation to evolve, but innovation does not stand still. Innovation pace is fast. Regulatory guidance is slow. And so there's this constant tension between innovation and trying to deliver helpful products to patients and physicians versus an agency that seems to be very risk averse at the moment. There's a lot of new initiatives that are being described. We heard about them today. But ultimately, the difference here is that you have a sense that the FDA is trying to protect the public health from unsafe products, as opposed to assuming that most products are going to be safe and effective based on the quality standards and guidance documents. And it's always easier for them to ask more questions and delay a decision than to suffer the consequences of oversight and congressional hearings if they make the wrong choice.
So I saw you shaking your head a minute ago, Marti. What's been your experience as a patient?
As a patient, it's been a very interesting experience, and the more I learn about how the FDA functions, I get absolutely raging. What I'm learning is that the approval processes between trusted nations and the United States are not that different. Studies that you have found and others show that there's pretty much an equal failure rate, and there will be failures when it comes to devices. That's a fact of life. But what I see is a drag. I'm here as an advocate for millions of U.S. patients like me who are needlessly waiting, and they're deteriorating and sometimes dying, waiting for FDA to approve medical devices that they desperately need and devices that are already successfully in use in other nations. So my angle is possibly a little bit different in that I'm enraged when I find out that my government is the barrier between me and the best solution for my spine problem. Because of what I've learned from my case and from many others, I'm in the process of instigating changes, the FDA practices and in insurance regulations, so U.S. citizens have equal access to and reimbursement for the most current medical technology that they and the doctors agree. Okay, so how do we decide which is what, right? Given the knowledge that we have about the differences between the EU system and the US system, and the outputs thereof are equal, okay? Do them differently. Outbound is good. The same. May I tell a little bit of my story to what I led up to? Briefly, my TOS specialist identified a cervical spine issue in MRIs in 2006, so he sent me straight over to UCSF Medical Center, Spine Clinic, with a neurosurgeon who had been a participating physician in a early artificial disc. So he diagnosed me. I'm reeling. Oh. But he immediately starts educating me, and we study my films. He tells me, we discuss all of my options, not just the typical American ones, and their benefits and consequences. Now, if I lived anywhere outside the United States and Canada, the solution would be very easy. That week, I could have checked into the hospital, had 2 artificial discs installed in my neck, the exact discs that I wanted, that are made 40 miles from my house, paid my small copay, and had 2 to 4 weeks recovery. But no, I live in the United States. So instead, these were my choices. 1, do nothing, wait for quadriplegia, which I was yay far from, as it turns out. 2, have fusions, which meant I'd likely have chronic pain, and very likely have more fusions, we call them serial fusions, each with a 4 to 6 month recovery. Or wait a bit for an older generation cervical disc in the FDA pipeline. It had been in the pipeline for 5 years. Our long CE marked, okay? Since 2003, it had been marked. So while I waited for the device approval, and it drug on, my spine degenerated to the point that my doctor and I thought, this is really dangerous. All my limbs are numb. Continence is an issue. My balance and grip, non-existent. People are taking care of me except for my basic needs. I cannot leave my house for fear of a paralyzing accident. Nor could I believe that a newer and more anatomically correct cervical disc made in the United States, which we believe was better for our program, and in fact it was made 40 miles from my house, and I couldn't get them in the United States. This, even though they were successfully functioning in thousands of patients in Europe and elsewhere. My only option was go to Europe, obviously. So it took some research, months of losing insurance appeals, months then of gathering money, draining our savings, accepting gifts, stripping my life insurance policy, making my 75-year-old husband return to work full-time. But finally, I had my 2-level ADR in 2009 in England. Devices made in Sunnyvale. I had them in England. My pain relief was immediate, and my disc function functioned perfectly. My UCSF neurosurgeon followed me, did the follow-on work, and is thrilled. This is ludicrous. How many patients had that device been in? Okay, so I managed to get the best solution for me, but it shouldn't have taken all my time and energy. And what about all the other Marti Congers in the world? People who are waiting for access to medical devices that already have foreign approvals and track records. I know because I receive phone calls every week from patients, from cardiologists to homemakers to auto mechanics. people who want to know how they might get the treatment that they need. And what about the devices common in Europe and in Asia, but bogged down in the FDA process? More advanced heart valves, the core valve, insulin pumps, and many others. Products often invented here, but aren't available to U.S. patients for years and years after the rest of the world has had it. It should not be that way.
So it's a compelling story. And I want to shift gears for a minute here to something that I think we not only sympathize, but as part of our work at CHI, the idea of invented in America and commercialized in Europe, or first developed in Europe or anywhere else in the world for powerful new technologies is not something that we want to see either for patients or for global competition. But one of the areas in which the FDA seems to be working well, and in fact, data recently published by Friends of Cancer Research and released by the FDA today that Vicki highlighted, was cancer drugs first approved in the United States in advance of Europe. And we have Paul Hastings sitting next to me here, who is an entrepreneur and the CEO of a small development stage cancer drug company. What are you saying, Paul?
Right. So first of all, Marty, you had everybody at hello, just so you know. I mean, that's an amazing story.
It's not done.
I know. We'll let you go on. And I almost say the panel's over because that's an amazing story. But I think what it says to all of us as drug and device company executives, and particularly us CEOs, is that we have to keep going and keep advocating and keep educating. And I think a lot of talk up here has been about environment rather than blaming the FDA, and I appreciate that because it is the environment and it is your government and the extreme bipartisanism that exists right now, not necessarily 100% the FDA. That doesn't excuse things like this whatsoever. But what are we seeing in oncology? I have a couple of examples, recent examples. One, Plexicon just got their BRAF inhibitor approved. Amazing, brand new, innovative concept for a drug with a amazing pre-selection of patients and an amazing response rate. Those kinds of things are happening quickly. I can tell you from my own experience, I had a call with the FDA yesterday. I sit in on our calls with the FDA. We're an 80-person company, and when our regulatory folks and our clinical folks discuss things with the FDA, I listen because I'm talking to Peg Hamburg and Vicki the way that we all are here because I'm on all these committees at CHI and Bio, and I want to make sure that what I'm telling them is true. And I was on the phone yesterday with Pat Keegan. If any of you know Pat Keegan, she is not an easy customer, right? And if this call was a year ago, the outcome would have been dramatically different. There was we have this issue, we need to figure it out together, and we need to keep moving to do that. And what's your proposal, company? And we had this meeting the day before where, I have to be honest with you, my clinical guys said they're not going to ask us our opinion, they're going to tell us what they think, they're going to, this is what's going to happen, boom, boom, boom. And she just opened it up and said, what's your recommendation? What do you think? And I was sitting there, and of course she doesn't know I'm on the call because I'm one of those silent participants, but I'm like biting, my fingers because I wanted to say thank you. And the whole discussion was about how to solve the issue. Now, part of that could be what we're doing, right? We're talking, the FDA is listening. I'm not sure that our administration has heard the message loud enough, and I think that's where we have to scream the message. But in oncology, we're seeing things happen. Likewise, I'm on the board of a company that just got a very simple drug approved on time with the right label, a sustained-release formulation of bupivacaine. And I was, again, amazed at the label we got that we wanted and the discussion that took place. That doesn't mean that other people aren't having huge issues, because I've seen other issues occur. But I think what's happening is by the advocacy that we're doing and the education we're doing, people are listening, and we're getting people's attention, and we have to let up, and we're probably going to get more, with sugar than we are with salt, or at least, a savory, salty, sugary mix would be, tough love, but we're listening as well. And I just can't, I talk to everyone I talk to, other CEOs, I say, why aren't you coming with us when we go to Washington? They want to hear from us, the little guys, with the 80 people companies, because we don't want to get, well, we'd love to get acquired for a wonderful premium, but that doesn't always happen. But we need to be the people they listen to. They listen to us, they listen to venture capitalists, they listen to CHI, they listen to folks that are representing education and innovation and small companies and jobs. And we have to just keep doing it.
Yes, my sense, and Vicki's being here is an indication of that there is a better and developing dialogue, and that the negotiations for PDUFA 5, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, that were recently concluded, that included pharma and bio, and more recently the MDUFA, Medical Device User Fee Act negotiations, have been constructive. And that what's involved in those negotiations are performance improvements in the agency and factors that would improve the relationship between sponsors and the agency. Farrellyn, have you seen dynamic change for better or worse, let's say over the past 5 or 6 years or recently?
Well, over the past 5 or 6 years, it's got dramatically worse, but I would say there's been much more interaction and collaboration more recently. And, you know, I had the opportunity, I didn't hear all of Vicki's talk, but what I did hear of that and some other meetings that I've had recently with leadership at the FDA, I want to put my plug in to stay. You know, we'll keep working at it from the industry side and trying to do the right things, and I'm going to implore the leadership at the FDA. You know, Vicki, hearing you talk was really positive. And so I think if we can, what happens is the people at the FDA, they do good work and then they get hired by industry, and we start all over again with the next crew. And so I think training of reviewers, putting more effort into that and trying to find ways to motivate and incent this group of people at the FDA who are really trying to make a difference. It's hard work, and so you can see that there is a group that's really trying to make a difference.
Yeah, Marty, I want to ask you something, and I know you have more to say, but one of the distinctions that we find sometimes around the FDA is between patient groups on the one hand and consumer groups on the other. And when we say consumer groups, we mean groups like Public Citizen, Sidney Wolf, people who are, if you will, hawkish on the agency and often say it doesn't do enough to protect safety, that its standards are too lax and so forth. By contrast, we have patient groups, most of whom represent people who are suffering from some real malady and need something now, and it's frustrating, enormously frustrating for them if they see products, for example, as you did, approved in Europe, not available in the U.S.
But made in the U.S.
Yeah, invented here, sure. So how do you approach this? How do you approach your advocacy?
My advocacy, it boils down to, well, I have a much bigger plan, but we don't have time to talk about that when it comes to the FDA and its organization. But to address the need that's right now, I do have to say I appreciate the FDA, the pressures they're receiving left, right, and center. And I'm contributing to that. And they have a need to protect patients. But they need to reset their priorities back to being patients first and political risk aversion later. Because they're both mostly just hanging their head, keeping their heads low so they don't get shot off the top. And that's, if you just look at the organization, you can see that for yourself. Their goal of absolute assurance is impossible. That's what they're always after, absolute assurance. That's not possible because every single body is different. Patients are looking for reasonable assurance and timely approval or denial, because not every product makes it, so they can make informed decisions. If we are requiring medical devices, known medical devices, to come here and restart the approval process with clinical trials when they're already in hundreds of thousands of human bodies around the world, is a total waste of money, time, resources, and time patients don't have. They should just take them in, fast track them, or just take them in and put them on the market. But that's only for products with strong track records. We're not talking about every Tom, Dick, and Harry widget, okay? But the other part of it is the equal access, is the affordability, the reimbursement. I'm also seeking legislation that requires all requires all health insurers, public and private, to cover FDA-approved medical devices, which the patient and the doctor decide is best from them. And as soon as we act on these issues, the sooner U.S. patients will have access to the devices they need at a reasonable price instead of waiting 2 or 10 or more years.
So that may be a little beyond the scope of the FDA when we get to payment. But
I'm
Ron,
sorry, I didn't hear you.
oh, I just said I think that looking to state laws to require coverage or create a new set of mandates is probably beyond the FDA discussion.
Oh, yes.
That we're
Oh,
having
yes.
here.
I admit, but I wanted to throw that in since I hadn't
Ron,
open forum.
if
Hire her, she's a CEO.
I was a CEO. And I have made progress, I want you to know. TV, news, newspaper, international, testify before Congress, but I can't do it
And you're
without
here.
other people's help. Yes, I'm here, but I need other people's help.
Ron, have you seen a change in dynamics? Again, one of the things that we've seen in our work with BCG is some hopeful signs, maybe some green shoots around the regulatory process that things may be getting better. I've heard anecdotally in talking to CEOs that there are some anecdotal evidence of performance improvements at the agency. What are you seeing right now, say, compared to more recently, and then over longer term, over the last 5 or 10 years?
So my experience is that there are pockets of excellence within CDRH. So my experience is primarily with CDRH and to some degree with the Center for Biologics for some combination products. There are some divisions within CDRH that are quite knowledgeable, quite clear on the kinds of requirements, and they seem very prepared for the discussions that companies come in for, and the review process seems to be somewhat predictable. I think, so I'm encouraged that there is a plan toward thinking about improving the FDA's internal process and their resources, training of new reviewers. I mean, there's a whole set of initiatives that we've been hearing about, and those all, I think, are sort of the green shoots you talk about. And I guess from my perspective as a regulatory consultant, I see both sides of the equation. I see the industry groups coming in, asking for support on their submissions and regulatory strategy, and I see the FDA process and working with a lot of different divisions. And I think that we all just continue to work toward best practices. The communication can be very collaborative, and it seems like when a company takes that sort of stance, let's talk about it, let's figure out a way forward. We want to bring good science to decision making. Here's some suggestions. I mean, I think that very much helps the FDA make a decision more in their favor. I think if a company takes a very antagonistic or adversarial position, it starts to break down communication, and it really, I think, interferes with a easy decision process. So there are clear opportunities, and I think if the company continues to try to advocate a good communication plan with the FDA, document it, you eventually get through the process. The FDA process is going to take longer than Europe, at least for the near future. It's not going to change overnight, but I think there are some initiatives that are being announced that ultimately should benefit everyone. But you have to just be realistic in your expectations. It's not, if you have an advanced device that is cutting edge or combines a device with another kind of therapy, a drug or biologic, it's going to be a much more complex regulatory process, and it's going to take longer. There's no doubt about it. So you need to be prepared for the long, hard process of going through that and plan ahead, because it's not going to be fast.
So, Paul?
Thank you.
No, I was going to ask you a question too, but go ahead
I got to challenge that just a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't accept that. I absolutely do not accept that. We should not be patient. We should be getting in their face with data. And I know you're saying that partially, but we cannot sit back. We're going to lose our innovative companies. And so what we have to do is, I agree with you on the approach. If we get in the FDA's face, you got a bunch of good, smart people there, that's not going to help. They're also in an environment. I think a lot of this is stuff we have to do at the congressional level to get them to back off of making judgments about products and side effects post-marketing, right? I'm a pharmacist. You have a patient here. I'm also a patient, by the way. And people do not misunderstand risk associated with drugs or devices, right? And I was on a panel with the CEO that makes that disc you were talking about, and he's just frustrated as hell. There has to be a way where there could be a meeting of the minds where we can change, not accept, but change, so that the FDA and the administration is on the same page regarding innovation and job creation, which are not bad words. And it's in Vicki's document,
Sure.
right? So I think we have to keep doing that, and I will not sit back and say, I'm going to be patient and wait for this. But I will proactively communicate. I will be positive. I will make sure that all my regulatory folks are that way, and we will get to this. But there has to be a certain amount of activism associated with this, or we're just going to be toast.
If I can just sort of build on that.
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
What you
Sorry.
don't know is the second order
No, good.
consequences of patterns that are established for a long period of time. It has been true for very many years that it has been faster to approve a very new medical technology in Europe than in the United States. Over time, people change their behavior based on that knowledge. So it was the case. You go look back at the data, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, there were a fair number of PMAs approved every year that are never approved in Europe. They were for specific US needs. The practice of medicine is different in the United States than in Europe. There are some things that have a market in the US that may never have a market in Europe. They don't exist anymore. That group of medical technologies has ceased to exist. Why has it ceased to exist? If I'm a venture capitalist and you come to me with a proposition that says, oh, I've got a product here, one of their first questions is, okay, what's your path to approval in Europe? And then what's your path to sort of exit and cash out to a big company? Well, if you can't answer that question, you don't get funding. So we don't see those devices. So that's why I think I agree with you. You have to sort of, push a little bit more. Otherwise, it's the sort of drugs that never get, the devices that never get developed, that we'll never know we never got.
And we've seen recent data, in fact, with respect to venture funding, both into drugs and devices as well as medical technologies, medical devices, that shows a fairly sharp decrease over the past 18 months. And in fact, the National Venture Capital Association published data on this that documented it. And if you talk to venture capitalists or if you look at their survey, the largest reason for that is the FDA overhang. The notion that there's so much uncertainty that it basically doubles the overall risk of investing in these fairly risky companies. So your point, I think, is very well taken. Marty?
One thing that we have to keep in mind is while we are all in business to make money, the products that we're making are for sick people. And that should be the focal point.
It's the central point.
The sick person. Yeah. If you make your $2 million off of it this year, I'm cool with it, because you invented a great device that's going to save a lot of people.
Yep.
But get it to them. Don't let it sit farting around in the FDA behind Joe Blow's desk and then Sally Jones' desk and then so-and-so's desk waiting for a question and a question and a question.
We've run to the end of our time. I want to thank the panelists for a terrific discussion and a absolutely central area to our industry and a set of hard questions that were difficult 20 years ago and remain difficult. But thank you all very much.
That is a lot.